Um, Sounds good. So, are we gonna do the dance thing?
Yeah, Max, how do you feel about dancing to start this live stream?
Why not?
You're already live, so don't do your dance. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. There you go. We are very excited to be with you again with a conversation with Max Rebo about hard things about hard. Sorry, that's a book. Hard things about. That's a very good book, right?
Yeah.
About how to solve hard problems, and Hard Things About Hard Things is a good book about that too. And we're going to tell you a lot about many more resources like that. But before that, let's get familiar with our guest. Hopefully, you all know Mariam. But Max, tell us more about yourself and some of your, interesting startup ideas.
Oh, actually, so quickly, sorry, Max, to interrupt. Before we get there, I just want to say this is a very special episode for me because I posted this on LinkedIn. This is my whole life in AI kind of coming together. The main reasons I got into AI machine learning is because of Maxwell. And special shout out to Sebastian Wenzel for introducing me to Max and Riz. And yeah, you both, Max and Amir, are two of the most interesting, smartest, dare I say, quirkiest CEOs I've been lucky enough to meet and work with. So very excited for this conversation. And Max, yeah, take it away. Want to hear about these terrible startup ideas as well.
Sure. Well, thanks. That's nice of you to say. Also a tough act to follow. So yeah, I mean, there's not like a lot of information about me on the internet. I actually took like a 3-year hiatus from pretty much an entire online presence, right? So I deleted my Facebook. I even deleted my LinkedIn, Twitter, everything. I just kind of like disappeared for a while because A, I felt like it. B, I just kind of needed to, detox, whatever. So you're probably not going to find that much about me online, which is by design. But you're hearing it from the horse's mouth today, which is, so I actually am a machine learning engineer, right, and researcher, having developed a lot of different approaches and different settings. I got my start in actually in kind of more of a national security space. So doing some work with the US government, and then transitioned a bit more to entrepreneurship. And since then, the last, let's call it 12, 13 years or so, just been building enterprise machine learning startups, right? And one after another, had an exit in there, a weird exit, but an exit. And throughout the course of that, having kind of been inside, very intense environments in national security, right, and all that sort of thing, but then also, coming out into, doing AI in financial services and healthcare, and even a bit of ad tech, and just, kind of some other, a pretty good selection of other areas, kind of built up some heuristics and concepts, which is, some of what I want to talk about today. But also throughout the course of that, you kind of get an instinct for like what's a good startup idea and what's a terrible one. And at least, your instincts about like which partners to pick, et cetera, that obviously takes time and whatnot, but hopefully you learn an instinct for which ones are good and which ones are terrible. That doesn't make the terrible ones any less hilarious, even if you never go with any of them. And so about 1.5 years ago, right actually about the start of the pandemic, to sort of entertain myself, in lockdown, I started just coming up with as many as I could per day. Let's call it 10, 15 per day. The worst startup ideas that I could possibly come up with. So one that just popped into my head half an hour ago, it is a subscription service for hot dog flavored lattes that are delivered by drone. So seriously, like this is the worst possible crap you can think of. And it's a nice offset, right? Because by day, right, doing very sophisticated machine learning at, Fortune 500s and governments and whatnot. And then by night or in the off hours, coming up with horrible ideas. So that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely relate to taking life easier after hours. which is a very weird period of time in the day. But yeah, I definitely relate to doing silly things. I usually just watch very, very silly Netflix shows because I can't think of anything else to do at that point, and my brain is completely dead. So I relate to that. And all right, so Mariam, you were telling me yesterday the context that you met Maxwell was when you started building a community. And speaking of hard things, building a community is a hard thing. Tell us a little about that. How did that start? That initial contact and how your journey in AI started.
Yeah. So to clarify, I started the community because I met Maxwell. So I was introduced to Max and his current co-founder at the time. They were doing an AI startup. It was the first time I had gotten introduced to that space. So throughout months of conversations with them, it forced me to look into it. Max was kind enough to send me a variety of intro resources to start as well. I still have that saved from Slack somewhere, Max. And as part of it, they were raising money for their startup. They offered me a role once they raised money, and we decided to start a community in AI based out of New York Artificial Intelligence, NYAI.co. We started it, for me, the interest was to learn more about the space. And because there were so many resources to start with, right? So these were expert curated resources from Max and from other experts and researchers that he knew in the space. So it was great. And we grew the community. Max came on as a board advisor and also speaker for a few events. Once they raised money, I eventually came on to work for that company full time. It's funny because that company is not even on Max's LinkedIn anymore because he's done so much since 2017.
It's been a wild ride. I'm telling you though, so at that time, when we started NYAI, right? It was the AI scene in New York was just really weird, right? Like you had a handful of leading companies that were doing interesting stuff. Google was obviously, up there in the Port Authority building. And they always do interesting stuff, but they don't really talk to anybody about it very much. But there just wasn't, it was sort of this weird environment where you just had little pockets of stuff going on, but hardly anybody. There was no real connectivity, right? Like there was very little of what we're doing right now, where we're just broadcasting out, these sort of heuristics and resources and whatnot. I mean, obviously that was going on online, but there was very little that was sort of anchored to the New York ecosystem itself, right? Obviously, that's not what we're doing today necessarily, but NYAI was very much that. It's in the name. And so one of the things that, the kind of the desire behind it was we started, my old co-founder at the time, we started looking for meetups to go to meet and talk to other AI startups and some of the researchers working there and just whatever, kind of have a symposium, right? To just talk about their recent papers or big projects or whatever. And it turned out that there was basically nothing like this, right? Like you had the big tech meetup that was 30,000 people or whatever it was, bonkers, right? That's whatever. Occasionally they do a machine learning talk, not really the right density, right? To kind of get that kind of interaction. So yeah, we got it started, and at one point it was actually the largest AI/machine learning focused conference/meeting group on the East Coast. With I think it was 2,500 members, of which about 200 to 250 could regularly show up, right? So it's about 10% recurring basis. And frankly, most of that was limited by the space that we could typically get. But that was sort of the beginning of me trying to share, resources and also bring together other people who can do that, right? Because it's such a huge part of community building. And Amir, I'm sure you guys know this better than anybody, right? Given what you're doing. But it's such a big part of the community. And at the time, like I said, it was just, there wasn't that much around to be able to do this kind of stuff. So it was necessary. It was fun. Frankly, I think something similar needs to happen here in London soon, in terms of a more casual meet.
Yeah.
No. We've got the Turing Institute and stuff, but that's all a bit more buttoned up and a little more formal.
That was a beautiful recollection of all of it. Thank you for saying that. And Amir, I'll flip the same question to you. You know, why did you start your community?
I mean, it's funny you mentioned going to meetups and not finding what you were looking for, because at a time when I got interested in AI and ML, I was living in London, UK, and I used to go to a lot of meetups there. And then when I went back to Toronto, I continued doing that because I was job hunting, and meetups were good places to meet people. But when I got a job and I had a regular life, then I got bored with the meetups, because there wasn't really, like, all of them were like AI 101 kind of meetups. There were very few ones that had really the meat that I was looking for, and that's why I started my own group, and very quickly grew up to a few thousand. We didn't even go on Meetup. Like we were just duplicating every week a Google Calendar invite, up to the point that it got too big that it was not manageable, and we started doing Eventbrite and whatever. But we didn't have a Meetup until literally last year, when Mariam came on board, and she was like, "That's crazy." But yeah, definitely the problem, I guess the hard problem of keeping track of all the knowledge that is just in the air, was what I was passionate about, and what I was lacking in my life. And that's how I started my community. So on the topic of hard problems, let's go back to that. So what do we mean by hard problems? Maxwell, what's your definition of that?
I mean, especially when you look at machine learning centered, right, AI centered issues or problems, which is kind of where I want to focus today. It's especially the case, like, something is especially hard when there's not really a lot of supporting work that's really been proven necessarily, it's like when you start to stray further and further away from that which has already been demonstrated, shown, so on and so forth, right? So you're kind of operating on some assumptions, some theoreticals, right? You're kind of going outside of like what is necessarily known. That's kind of like the pure hard problems. There are kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of dumb hard problems, or problems that are hard for dumb reasons, like, oh, our data is just awful, right? But that, it's not like it's theoretically difficult. It's something that could be very simple. Like, you could be training a linear regression model, but if your data is crap, then you're not getting anywhere. That's not really the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm really talking about cases where it's like you need to push just a little bit beyond, right? You need to think about, how do we kind of fit this with the bigger organizational strategy, and particularly in fast-paced environments like startups. You need to think about how are the executives, leadership going to perceive this? How are they going to budget for this? Right, there's lots of different considerations, but the kernel of it is really like, we have something we need to do. There isn't like a paper that we can just pull from archive and just kind of re-implement that or something. So we kind of need to tune some knobs, innovate, and kind of push forward. That's kind of how I think of it.
Cool. And maybe you can give us a little more information about what you're working on now.
Well, so big asterisk here. We haven't formally announced yet. We're doing that very, very annoying cliche stealth startup thing. I know it's so cliche at this point, but we don't want everybody necessarily copy pasting what we're doing, or at least trying to. We enjoy a little bit of a lead, and we're going to try to keep that at least for another few weeks. But what we're working on right now is it's actually in the code generation space, Amir. So I see there are already some resources on the platform about that, which is cool. It's good to see these conversations starting, because I think it's just going to be a massive, massive new category, right? But what it is we basically we have an AI system that writes code to specifications, right? It's more structured than what you'd see with like Codex or something, and it's also broader in scope. So it's like whole applications, like an entire microservice, an entire API, an entire connector, let's say, with some built-in data normalization and so on, right? As opposed to like zooming on individual functions. But basically what we're doing is we come in, and we bring our product with us, right? The AI itself, which TB revealed. And we just say, hey, look, that big integration project that you're going to go spend like 9 months and let's say like $500,000 worth of engineer and data science time doing, don't do that, please. Don't do that. Work with us, work with our toolkit, and doing it that way, we can bring that down to 72 hours or less, okay? Because the AI literally writes the code, right? We've seen this now with Codex, we've seen it with Alpha Code now, also a cool architecture. And so we know that this is becoming quite possible, right? And it's becoming very interesting. It's just a case of obviously making it stable enough, making it secure enough to actually be viable in an industrial setting versus just kind of fiddling around in the IDE, right? But that's kind of the kernel. That's what we do. We help them basically move faster. We save them a ton of time and money by making these projects go anywhere from 10 to 100 times faster. So the data science folks really love it, and that's actually something we didn't expect. Just the other day was on a call with the AI and data science team of a large institution, let's say, and just wow, the response was incredible. But we kind of thought of it more for developers and engineers initially. But as we're getting into it, it seems like the data science and ML folks actually are quite attracted to the concept, which is it's interesting. So we're based in New York technically, although I'm kind of a transatlantic bird, if you want to call it that.
I do want to call it that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of, like, when I'm listening to you talking about the problem that you decided to solve, I hear a lot about what we've been going through as well over the past few months, because we sort of decided to go back to the drawing board and figure out more concretely what problem it is that we are solving, because we did launch a product and we got some traction, but we were looking for something much bigger. So we really needed to think through how we were doing that. And I've written extensively about this from my point of view. But Mariam, maybe you can talk a little about how we went through essentially breaking down a very complex problem that we were trying to solve into smaller pieces, some of the tactical things we did. And then we'll go back to Maxwell about that as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, at a high level, like, it all starts with properly documenting things, right? And then organizing them in a way where you can easily access. So that was a big part of.
You don't need to document. You can just skip it. Skip it.
People can figure it out on their own. Shocking.
They can figure it out on their own.
Documentation.
If they can't, then they're weak. They're not good enough. Sorry.
Oh man. So I mean, that was a big part of what I felt like I did when I first joined Aggregate Intellect. I was like, where is everything? Let's get it all together and organized. And that eventually kind of led to the product that we were building to help document not just knowledge for ourselves, but more technical how-to knowledge. Especially if this case keeps coming up for like onboarding someone, which Amir can talk a little bit more about in detail. But yeah, I think the recipes have been a great thing for us to document some things for ourselves. And then, we developed like a mini design sprint at the end of last year, which I think was hugely important for where we decided to pivot the product. And yeah, and then also making sure all the user interview notes are easily accessible and making sure you're spending time doing really understanding the user personas. These are all things that most startup founders, these are one-on-one things. So maybe we'll jump into the more technical problem solving pieces.
You say that, but I'm telling you, user research, man, people skip it. Founders love to skip user research. I've done it, actually. I'm guilty of that too. I skipped user research. We built a product and everybody looked at it and they're like, what is this? It's like, oh boy, we kind of messed up here.
Yeah. So
yeah, you say that, but
yeah. Actually, I mean, that's a very, very interesting topic. And again, like I've written very extensively about it in my monthly newsletter. But up to 3 months ago, the way I was operating was that I would do user interviews for a few weeks, and then I assume, oh, I know enough, and then go work for several months. and then I'll be like, oh my God, why is this not working? About 3 months ago, right after we did the designer sprint, like it went so well, like because designer sprint forces you to talk to people, and it went so well that right after that we started doing daily interviews. Like you just set down that this is a first principle. We have to talk to at least one person every day, and then once a week all the staff would come together with a bunch of users, and we do just a bunch of user interviews in parallel. And it wasn't until daily tweaks to the design and the product that we started saying, okay, now we have a much better understanding of how the user perceives the problem that they have and how our solution is solving that. So it's not only breaking it down, it is then also validating it on a very, very continuous way as a very important first principle. But I know, Maxwell, you have a series of first principles too. So what are some of the things that you've discovered so far?
Sure. So I think the best kind of way to go through it is obviously, like, we don't want to be super duper structured, but I want to make sure we have time for each one, because they're individually, but they're important individually and together, right? But it kind of distilled it down to three principles that I work from. So like anytime I'm whether it's one of my companies that I've started, I'm building the product, or it's something else that I've joined up with, such as like Neokova, where I was CTO. That's something where I came in, they already had a lot of product and a lot of stuff, and then it was just taking it forward from there, right? So regardless of the scenario, these three principles that I work from tend to work really well. Some of them have been talked about by others, which we'll touch on, and may seem even painfully obvious. But I think it's good to reiterate this kind of stuff because it's just is way too easy to forget. It's way too easy to be lazy, or just lots of different things can come up. But the first one is basically work from first principles, right? We've heard Elon Musk say that a lot. We've heard who else? I guess like Sam Altman's mentioned it. There have been a bunch of kind of major tech folks, right? Silicon Valley folks who have kind of harped on this. I think Elon's approach is probably the most salient, or at least to me individually, and we can kind of circle back to that. How that works. The second is not to be afraid to reuse old tactics, right? They're old for a reason. Because I think part of that is like you don't always want to just try to reach for kind of the newest, hottest thing, right? Which is, it's a problem, right? In deep learning, in kind of AI machine learning more broadly, right? There's a real hype factor that's kind of set in, right? You go to CVPR or ICML or whatever, there's like tens of thousands of people showing up to these things now, right? Tickets are booked out in the first day or two. There's a lot of hype, there's a lot of whatever, and that makes sense. But sometimes not the old ways necessarily, but sometimes kind of simpler and older mechanisms, tried and true stuff can really help. Which kind of leans into the third point, the third principle, although they're not the same thing, which is that a hard problem or a difficult problem doesn't necessarily mean that it requires a fancy solution, right? Like you don't necessarily need to flourish, right, and kind of throw in these extra levels of finesse. And that's something that even like I said, probably 13 years into it now, it's something that even I still can get caught up in, right? Like I'll try to do something fancy and cool and whizzy, and then I realize, like, wait a second, this is too much. We need to kind of scale it back a little bit. Those are the three things that are the three principles that I kind of operate from. And to that end, I've kind of referenced a few papers that are kind of there are different areas and a little bit different, non-overlapping, slightly overlapping, but I do consider each of them to be sort of archetypical, right, of the kinds of principles at play, right? Like it really kind of exemplify, the researchers who publish this stuff, following these kinds of principles, or at least they would appear to. I don't know if they actually were, but for each of those three, I mean, happy to kind of go through them in any order. They don't need to be ordered at all. Or we could just focus on the hot dog flavored latte startup. I mean, it's up to you guys. How are we going to play this?
Well, now that's an option.
It is an option. It's coming soon to a San Francisco office building near you.
Is that in itself too? I'm kidding.
I mean, Max, it's funny that you say that the simple solutions, the tried and true one, are sometimes the best for complex things. We recently came across that when we were figuring out our own product analytics, and Amir can give a little bit more detail, but we went through, obviously we have Google Analytics, we have Data Studio, we were looking into Mixpanel and Amplitude and all of these other things. We were looking into ways just to export the data ourselves so we can run our own analysis. What Amir came up with seems very simple, but makes a lot of sense, and also gives us the right kind of attribution that we were looking for from each line item. So yeah, Amir, you want to give a little more light on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you also invited somebody at NYAI who talked about, breaking down the problem into modular pieces, putting together an absolutely minimal version of that can move from A to B, where A is where the user is and B is where they want to be, and just measure the hell out of that to figure out, okay, what is working, what is not working, in addition to what we already said, which is, talking to them. And, that analytical approach to, we all have heard, build fast and break things or something like that. So, but the part that we normally don't talk about is that just breaking is not the goal. The goal is to let the user break it so that you can measure how they broke it and then fix it, right? So that's such a fundamental piece. And, all the big problems, as Max said, have a ridiculously simple solution. It doesn't solve all the problems in the world, but it solves a good chunk of, the problem for some users. And then your goal is to give them that solution and start watching them. I mean, not in a stocky way, but, hopefully you can collect a bunch of qualitative data by talking to them and, significant amount of quantitative data. But the goal is to see where it breaks. Like, why is it not working the way you expected? And just, it is modular, so we can look at different pieces of it. You can collect data about different pieces of it, and then gradually just get it where it needs to be until, you fix the problem of going to the moon with, one step at a time. And I'm, in my corporate life, and as well, now that I'm, doing stuff in my own startup, I've always come across this temptation to go for the fanciest model, as you said, right? I know one of the resources you were suggesting as the reading material for this session is we need deep learning for time series. And that's something that comes up everywhere. Like, do we need deep learning for anything really, right? At least in the first iterations of building a problem. Like, eventually, sure, one day you figure out enough things that okay, sure, you can try to replace deep learning when appropriate, or for specific type like NLP problems, you might have to start from deep learning. But in general, do you really have to? So that's definitely a good talking point.
I mean, it's something that, even now, well, like when you look at code generation, for example, that's another good one where, I think if you were to ask anybody right now and say, okay, what would be anybody who, has enough of a background, let's say, okay, what would be the only way, or like, could you do AI code generation without, full program synthesis, right? Without deep learning? Like, could you do it robustly, right? And in a state-of-the-art way without using deep learning? They'd probably say no, probably not, right? Candidly, I'm as of this moment kind of that opinion, because pretty much everything that's been done to date, or all the kind of state-of-the-art approaches are more or less based on transformers, and there's kind of that lineage, right? That lineage of models is very, very prominent in this space. But we're pretty early into this, and my co-founders and I are finding ways to optimizations, tweaks, right, and simple kind of tricks, along the way that has nothing to do with deep learning. It has nothing to do with any of that. It's literally just iterating on the problem and figuring out ways to restrict the search space, right? That's a big one. Especially when you think about code generation, right? You've got a model that has to choose between however many quadrillions of possibilities for, a line of code to slot in. Good God, how do you restrict that, right? How do you narrow down that search so it has, whatever, a logarithmic version of that. That's a big challenge, and something where we're finding little tricks and whatnot that aren't a new transformer architecture, that aren't training it on more data. They're just kind of simple little tricks that we layer onto it. But that paper that I linked, that's actually a newer addition to my personal library. It was a friend sent it to me a few weeks ago, and it kind of blew my mind because in it, the approach that they use is something that I've actually been using for like 5 years, right? I've used it. I know that sounds like such a hipster thing, like, oh, I was using it before it was cool, but like it really is something I've been doing for a long time. And I'm like, huh, like I always kind of knew that was something, that worked well, right? But for me, it was just sort of a heuristic. I never really thought about it in this fundamental way. But what the paper authors have done is they've rigorously benchmarked, a very similar approach. It's just a gradient boosting model. It's remarkably simple, against, like temporal fusion transformers and a bunch of other, modern architectures for doing this stuff. And the gradient booster wins. It's jaw dropping. To everyone watching this, read the paper in the links. It's jaw dropping how it's just like, I actually didn't believe it. I was like, I texted my friend back. I was like, no way, that can't be right. But I read the paper and I read it again. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. That actually does make sense though. And it's kind of a slap in the face for those of us who have gotten into a bad habit of over-engineering things, right? That was me last year. I had a hard lesson learned, falling back, even after all these years, falling right back into over-engineering things. And then I was like, I gotta get back to basics, right? So that principle of like, don't be fancy, don't choose the fancy thing. It's something that just comes back over and over again. If you don't pay attention, right? If you don't kind of, keep flexing that muscle of like exercising, restraint, then yeah, you will start to get lax like I did last year, and kind of start over engineering again. Miriam, I think you've kind of had a good perspective on this, both being in the AI community and kind of on the community building side of it, but also kind of being on the inside of different AI startups and working on some of that directly. I mean, what do you think about this approach of kind of adapting, but also like self-regulating your behavior and like kind of pulling back to best principles?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it comes to mind. I don't really know if you remember Cole Ingram. He was a speaker at an NYAI event. He talked about modularizing complex problems specifically. So I'll include some of those resources in the recipe, so you can check that out too. But yeah, it comes back to, and Max, I think we were talking about this in the prep as well. As much as you can simplify not only the solutions and look for the simple solutions, but the problem itself into these little chunks and have a clear path of how all of those interrelate, then that's the only way to kind of make it digestible. And I've seen many different approaches at the different startups, and that seems to be the only way to not only solve it, but easily onboard new people and to get their buy-in to even want to work on it, because it's not such a scary problem anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think to just put what you said in a slightly different light, or look at it as a slightly different angle, is that you have a problem and you're trying to build a solution for it. And we talked a lot about the problem side, which is a complex problem, and that's what we are calling the hard thing. And you want to break that down into the sub problems and the components of it. But then on the solution side, also there are different components that need to be built to put together, like Lego pieces to build a solution. And there are normally two ways that you can achieve that. Either there is an old trick, like Max said, and you grab it and adapt it to your problem. Like you take an adaptive approach. Or you grab a bunch of these that were not previously put together and you put them together, sort of like an innovative approach. And all of these pieces, like nobody comes up with ideas out of vacuum, like creativities. We are not, drawing a very, innovative or creative painting here, right? Like we are building a concrete solution for a concrete problem, right? And most of the creative solutions have been already used in a slightly different setting. Like the other day on another episode, we were talking about how Slack was originally just the internal chat app in a video game company. And when their video game wasn't going well, they were like, where else can we use this, right? And that's how, and actually, funny story about the founder of Stack, apparently he's the founder of Flickr too, which was also a failed video game company. So,
Stuart Butterfield?
I don't remember the name.
Yeah, Stuart. One can only hope that Stuart Butterfield can do a proper video game soon, or video game. And in fact, I would pay good money to see him go toe to toe with Todd Howard of Bethesda Softworks.
Right.
That would be a funny kind of product debate, game debate.
Interesting. Stuart, if you ever see this, we're behind you.
So, Todd Howard is notorious in the video game industry, in kind of a good way, but still notorious. He's a fascinating character. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting us off track here.
Might need to do a video game episode.
I think so. Well, actually, it's really interesting because like AI is really taking root in the video game industry, right? And if you look at like Epic Games and Nvidia in particular are really going kind of ham on this, right? And in full disclosure, so my company, unnamed blah 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 company, we are actually part of the Nvidia Inception program, right? So we're partner. Awesome, yeah. So we're partnering with Nvidia. Doesn't mean I'm proselytizing their stuff. They are really doing cool work in this area. But it's something we've actually thought about a bit on the code generation side as well, because we're like, well, crap, like, if we've got a system that can fairly reliably write, good microservices, good connectors, good APIs, whatever, different kind of backend components and whatnot, could we theoretically train it on Unreal Engine, like the new one, Unreal Engine 5 is coming out? Could we train it on some of that stuff and see if it can generate, little functional modules, right? So we're kind of thinking about also that space, but not for right now. Right now, we're very focused on financial services as kind of the core. That's a lot of our backgrounds, and we have a lot of interest there. But don't underestimate the video game people. That's what I'm trying to say, because they're Stuart Butterfield. He's one of them. He's really done a remarkable thing.
For sure. We've gotten at least 2 very good products out of somebody even failing at creating video games. So
it's remarkable because Slack, and I mean, even just from a startup, I know we're straying from like the machine learning stuff, but this is a fun one. Like when Slack showed up, there were 1 million chat applications, right? There were a zillion of them. There were so many options. Some of them were whatever. Some of them were not so good. Some of them were great, but kind of but not well known, right? So it was just kind of this weird little niche landscape. But there were a lot of options, and Stuart Butterfield shows up and just repackages it, right? Takes it out of that other company, like you said, and just all of a sudden, pow, right? It just becomes the thing, and now we all use it, right? And we're sitting here using it right now. I just think it's remarkable. Like, I think because prevailing wisdom, especially in the Valley, would say, "Oh no, that's too crowded, right? Don't enter a crowded space. Like, what's your differentiator, right?" I can only imagine Stuart Butterfield heard like, "How are you guys different, right? What's your differentiator?" Probably 1 billion times, right? In pitching Slack, but push through, right? And here we are. I think and similarly in machine learning, it can start to get kind of discouraging when you're working on a new concept or a new idea, right? Because it is starting to get pretty crowded, like I said before. And when you think about differentiation and you think about, especially going toe to toe with big labs, like we're doing code generation stuff. Who does that put us up to? It puts us up to OpenAI and DeepMind. that's a tall order. It's difficult. But especially when you're entering a crowded space or a space that pits you against really, really formidable, other forces, let's say, it's something you kind of have to just take a deep breath and be like, okay, I can do this, can focus, and power through like Stuart Butterfield did. I think actually a really good point to layer onto that is, like, you think about the kind of emergent, interdisciplinary areas that are becoming really interesting. So you think about like the electronic health records and like cybersecurity stuff, right? That's something that, some insiders maybe saw coming a long time ago. But now there's like, okay, there's cybersecurity products that are specifically focused on healthcare and healthcare areas that are powered by machine learning. That's some of the coolest and most innovative stuff out there. But it's something you wouldn't have necessarily seen coming unless you kind of had an inside, view on that trajectory. If you're the founder of one of those, then you can differentiate, right? And you're not up against this like, this constant pushback of like, okay, you have to differentiate against a million other providers. But I do think the piece about staying true to a few principles like we're talking about, and kind of not getting distracted necessarily, or not getting too caught up in kind of the grind or the ebbs and flows of startup life, right? I think can really help you stay grounded and focused and actually do some meaningful applied work, right? And that you can talk about and that you can iterate on, right? I don't know, Amir, you're nodding a lot. It seems like you have something to add to that.
I'll throw it to Amir in a second. I just want to quickly say that I love that we're obviously focused in this conversation talking about kind of more on the technical product engineering side of solving hard problems, but I love that you just brought in the kind of psychological aspects also, that even if it is a crowded space, like sometimes you need to believe in what you're doing, and obviously validated through tons of user interviews and then power through. But yeah, and then also finding, I think so yeah, I'll just throw it to Amir actually.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I'm nodding is, going back to the same topic that we were talking about, which is, grabbing old tricks and adapting them or combining them for new ideas. A very good example of it is what you said, like in interdisciplinary fields where, like we talk to a lot of users and, potential customers that are very interested in what we're building because it gives them a very good tool to deal with those problems, right? So, for example, it is an agri-tech company. They have a lot of climate scientists, and they know just enough about machine learning, but they've been doing these crazy, complicated, sophisticated mathematical and statistical models for years and years and years, and now they're trying to grab this other tool, machine learning, and adapt it to what they've been doing for a very long time. And that's a very good example of what we were talking about, like solving a hard problem, but grabbing something that is well known in other fields and adapting it to this problem. So that's a phenomenal example of how that can happen.
Well, what you're talking about, I think, is like the translational piece, right? So one of the papers that I link is as sort of a good example of just really going from first principles. It's titled, it's a transformer-based causal inference framework for enhancing pharmacovigilance, right? So it's, it's very much in bioinformatics, pharma, and so on. And there's a lot of interesting work going on in deep learning and modeling on pharmacological data, right, clinical data related to it. But it's interesting because a lot of times it doesn't necessarily get picked up, right, by, let's call it, kind of more mainstream, AI research trends, right? As evidenced by the fact that not everyone is using these causal transformers now, right? Which they frankly should. I think any scenario, I'm very biased here, so, take it with a grain of salt, but I'm very kind of ideological about this concept of like, if you can have an actual, good causal model and not just correlation based, then you should, right? Especially when you're talking about clinical data, especially when you're talking about, medicine of all kinds, right? But the funny thing is, I mean, this paper, it's not, I wouldn't call it the best known paper necessarily, right? And you don't necessarily see quite as much of its contents being translated out. But it's a really, really, really good example of working from first principles, because the authors just were like, okay, I mean, you imagine that they were just started from like, okay, we do need causality in this model. We need to be able to extract, or at least we need to be able to approximate some kind of meaningful causal structure, right? A causal tree in their case, that kind of motivates the rest of the data and the data journeying process, right? Okay, we need that, but we also need to be able to to be able to model effectively, right? We don't want to hand tune all these probabilistic models or whatever. So okay, so let's use a transformer approach, because we know that those tend to work really well in lots of different problems. One kind of imagines that was their thought process, and the result is phenomenal, right? They successfully mix Perlian do calculus, right, with modern transformer architectures. That is bonkers. When I first read that, I was like, what on earth? Like, they didn't just do an autoregressive transformer, which some have done, which is cool, right? Not trying to downplay that, but like, this is a full-on, full-throated do calculus injection into a transformer architecture. It's just amazing how they were able to do that. So to me, that's a really good example of just starting from the most basic stuff, like what do we need and what do we know, right? And then trying to like cross-reference those and try to build that kind of structure, right, to move it forward. Anyway, I think that's just a really, it's a nerdy example in a way, because it's obviously way down in pharmacological, deep learning modeling and whatnot, which is its own very, very fun, very cool community. But I think that paper in particular deserves a lot more attention and should be learned from, right, as a good causal architecture, or at least a good prototype of it. But Miriam, I think you're also kind of looking like you have something to say over there. I just went for it into causal land. I'm like, Perlian this and do calculus that, and I don't want to lose our audience here, but
I think this is probably what our audience is most interested in, actually. So I want to loop it back to all of this, and I want to touch base on that question earlier. Like, do we actually need deep learning for time series? I think that could be an interesting convo. I just want to quickly say, with like the kind of the overlaps and the interdisciplinary things that you're mentioning on top of the causality stuff, it brings to mind that we'll be doing an environmental data science workshop. So machine learning at the intersection of environmental sustainability, all of that. So yeah, that I already dropped it in the chat, but it's going to be a free workshop. There'll be 3 sections, and you'll get access to experts working in this field already. You will learn diversity and scale of Earth, and we get to work with real environmental data. It will cover multi-dimensional spatio-temporal structure of Earth and environmental data included in that. And yeah, you'll get to play with some Python, and there are some specific projects that you can work on. So there's a land cover, classification using satellite imagery, machine learning for freshwater management, and stream flow prediction in the Canadian prairies. So those all have different start times, and I'll share the link in the chat. But yeah, that aside, I do want to get back to the topic of deep learning for time series. So what are your thoughts there?
Plenty, and it actually relates to this environmental piece. I would like to do a special shout out to any practitioners or aspiring practitioners, right, data science and machine learning folks who are watching this or will watch it, which is this: if you, not you Amir, not you Miriam, but the broader you, if you perhaps by chance maintain a belief that modeling, environmental data, right, doing, environmentally focused machine learning and so on, is not as valuable as other areas, you have a wonderful opportunity to relieve yourself of that belief. And here's why. Because there's this wonderful little thing called ESG, okay? Environmental, social, and governance. A lot of you probably already know this, but virtually every financial institution and every regulatory body on the planet is intensely focused on this right now. Okay, and for good reason, right? We need to figure out how to tether our fundamental economics to incentives to be good stewards and to improve how we do things environmentally and so on. So it all makes sense. But what this means, again, is that now there's real money tied to solving these problems, right? Because the banks are doing this, the central banks are doing this, the regulators are focused on this. So I think, again, if you still are thinking to yourself, oh, I don't want to do necessarily environmental science with my computer science degree, et cetera, no, go for it. Frankly, I can think of 10 banks, 10 major institutions off the top of my head who would hire you tomorrow just to do ESG stuff. So it's a hot area. It's something to really look into, I think. And so I'm glad to hear you guys are doing that workshop, because that's going to be super cool. But speaking of time series and doing machine learning on time series, so again, done a lot in financial services, worked with a lot of banks, did some hedge fund, some quant stuff, and have done it in, worked with time series and different signals of that nature in a lot of different areas. And it's another one of these cases where it's like, there's so much new stuff coming out all the time, right? You can sit there and peruse, archive and other paper sources, and there's always a cool new paper, always a cool new architecture, right? If you go to one of the conferences, ICML or something, then it gets even worse, right? Because then you're surrounded by all these smart people who are doing all this great stuff, and it can just seem really it's almost overstimulating, right? It's just so magical. It's like, wow, like that model architecture I spent the last 6 months, optimizing and tuning for my problem, I'm just going to throw it out immediately because there's a new and better one, right? But even more fundamental than that, perhaps, is this idea that maybe you don't need even an entire family of algorithms like deep learning, right? Maybe you don't need a transformer to solve that problem. Maybe you don't need, whatever, some fancy new convolutional architecture, whatever it is. And that's kind of the one I was talking about, where they're like, look, this gradient boosting approach on a windowed multivariate, kind of feature feature it actually just outperforms all of these state-of-the-art architectures. Okay, and they did some fine tuning and whatnot, so it's a pretty fair comparison. But when you think about then what you guys are focused on and the environmental side of it, right, and starting to really lean into applications, right, and interdisciplinary kind of applications on environmental data, environmental problems, I would really encourage everyone to look at that paper and to really kind of let that sink in for that problem set, because again, we're talking about 10 plus years of research that went into the comparison. And fortunately for those of us who are looking at it, but perhaps not so fortunately for those who did the other research, gradient booster still wins, right? At least with that feature engineering output. But it's a good reminder, right? It's kind of a splash of cold water to be like, okay, wait, let's not just go for the new fancy transformer model. That's kind of the takeaway. They're very exciting, but they don't necessarily solve everything. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah,
I think the reason that any of us is interested in solving hard problems is that the upside of impact is huge. Like, we want to solve a hard problem because we think that makes a huge difference. Sometimes we want to solve hard problems because we enjoy torturing ourselves, I guess. But most of the time, you're looking for a big impact. You want to change the world that we live in. We have a different vision for the world. And as Maxwell very well said, solving environmental problems using machine learning is one of those very top shelf ones. That's huge. I like that some people are like, oh, we have to protect the planet, but planet doesn't care. It's completely fine to wipe us completely unless we do something to fix it. So it is a very high impact type of project, and literally in this case, government of Canada is paying us to educate the public about it. We are, not paying us, but they're giving us money to deploy it, to educate the public about it. This is such a big problem. big financial institutes and big different types of foundations and public sector is just going crazy to figure out how to solve this. And they want you citizens to come in and solve these problems, these very hard problems. These are very, very challenging. So on that topic, check out all the links that we put in the chat. And the hour flew by. Do you believe it? It's an hour?
It was a bad startup idea. Sorry, guys. I sidetracked it. Sorry about that.
It's all good. So Maxwell and Mariam, what's the verdict after this 1 hour of talking? What's the verdict? What's your call to action for anybody who is watching or will watch this?
Max, I'll let you go first.
All right. Look, my call to action is simple. Work from first principles. Don't be afraid to reuse old tactics, even if your colleagues think are silly or outdated or whatever. Just give it a shot. It can work. And don't be fancy when you don't need to. Right. Just keep it simple if you can. Those would be my big things. And then kind of a bonus points again. ESG, environmental stuff. This is a huge area. I think that practitioners can get involved, right, and get involved. Get involved at the ground level with kind of a growing, emerging area in financial services and in governance and so on. So definitely, don't discount that and give it a look.
Awesome. Thank you, Max. Yeah, you're so right about the ESG and it being such a big problem. In fact, as part of the workshop, they're giving us money to pay the people that complete the workshop. How much prize money is there available, Amir?
$500 per person.
How often do you get paid to do a workshop? So that's pretty cool. So yeah, I guess my call to actions are going to be a little bit more specific. All of the links and the things that we mentioned today will be in the recipe. So that will be linked in the chat and also in the description of the video. A recipe, if you don't know, is like an interactive resource list, but it's also social and contextual. So the social piece, if you want to add any resources yourselves or you think want to correct anything, you can comment on the recipe, you can suggest resources yourself. So yeah, help us make it better so more people can access this information. And I will just quickly end with saying that, women, it is Women's Month and International Women's Day was yesterday. We are doing a Women in AI week next week. Which is a free virtual week of AI events focused on and celebrating women in partnership with 10 other organizations from around the globe. So join us. We'll have 6 different virtual events happening from March 14th to March 18th, showcasing 20 awesome speakers in AI. I'll drop all the links. And as always, you can always ping me on Slack and just say hi.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mariam and Maxwell, for chatting with me. And I go back to something that Maxwell said very early in the conversation, and it was very true, but I didn't think about it when we were coming up with the topic of the session, which is there are 2 types of hard problems. There are hard problems that are organizational and hard problems that are worth solving. Well, I mean, of course, our organizational ones are worth solving too, but you know what I mean. So if you're working in a job that the majority of the time you're spending is on the former, like convincing your executives to do something interesting versus solving a problem that changes the world. Find something outside of your job that gives you meaning, because it's not fun. On that topic, read the book called Bullshit Jobs. It's literally the reason that I started my company, because I felt I needed to do something that made a difference. That is the second type of hard problems, not the first type. On that note, thank you so much for joining us. Check out the link in the show description with all the resources and notes about the stuff that we talked about. Thank you so much, Maxwell and Mariam, for joining me today. We will be back tomorrow talking about using machine learning in investment and how machine learning in real world works. A lot of us are trying to use reinforcement learning to predict markets, and our guests are going to tell us how that's going. Thank you so much. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.